Dad crawled. I was 9 when Dad began to crawl. I remember the summer had been a particularly long one, or at least it felt it. It was one of those years that didn't go the way you expect years to go. We'd had no rain since January, and the sun came out suspiciously early, though the temperatures remained low well into June, and it seemed to get dark far earlier than it should have on account of the fogs that would roll in each afternoon to snuff out the sunlight. I remember the unseasonable weather was the only topic of conversation among everyone in our town, but that was the same most years, and the weather being wrong is seemingly commonplace everywhere now. But that year had been especially off, memorably so, especially since it also brought us the September when Dad began to crawl. It wasn't as strange as it sounds, at least not to us. We grew to accept this new way of things quite readily. That was just something he did now. My dad was prone to change, though perhaps no more than anyone else outside of the madhouses. Sudden diets, interests, and hobbies that disappeared as quickly as they'd begun. Changes in style. The hat phase, famous to us. And he was in a habit of growing his hair long before shaving it all off and starting again. A little less growing back each time it came through. If you were to look through our family photographs, you'd be forgiven for thinking a different man assumed the role of Dad each year, and, figuratively speaking, you'd be right. He was difficult to know, not because he was especially guarded. If anything, he was rather open and forthcoming for a man of his era, but because of his variability. It's not that he wasn't a genuine or earnest man. I very much think he was, but he was multiple quite different genuine and earnest men all in one lifetime. My mom would jokingly say things like, "That's the man I married, all 12 of him," whenever he appeared with a new look or hobby or deeply held conviction about something. It didn't seem to bother her much, which I suppose is a good thing. To this day, I feel a great deal of envy whenever friends or people I meet describe their dads, even if the characterizations are usually negative. Everyone seems to present their dads. The drunks, the abusers, the evangelists, but they invariably knew them, even the worst of them. But my dad was my dad, I knew that much, and one day, my dad started crawling. I don't remember there being a clear point in time where he stopped walking, but nor was it a gradual development. It was a shift, straight from one way of things to the new way of things. Dad crawled now. When he moved around, he crawled on his hands and knees. Not like a dog. He crawled like a human adult male would crawl. If he needed to move fast, he'd arch up and use the balls of his feet to propel himself instead of his knees. Everything else was the same at first. He'd still talk to us normally, still do his chores and errands. Although, where once he might have been able to reach the high cabinet, for instance, he would now climb his way up to it if he could. And as far as any of us could tell, he still loved us just the same. And we loved him too. I don't remember there ever being a situation where I felt embarrassed by him, even when he'd go out and about in town like that. I was getting to the age where I was beginning to be embarrassed by a lot of things, and it even started having my mom drop me off round the corner from school so nobody would see us together, for no good reason at all. My mom was a perfectly normal-looking woman who dressed normally, behaved normally, and drove a normal car. It's just that sort of age where you resist being judged on what your parents are like. What, as even young kids suspect, you'll inevitably become. Yet, despite my ordinary squeamishness about being associated with my parents, I had no such misgivings about Dad walking around with me on all fours. I don't remember anyone mentioning it. No strange looks or loud whispering, and none of the kids at school ever brought it up, even the ones who would routinely wield any reachable tool to degrade and humiliate me, to make me feel like less of a person than I was. In hindsight, it seems very odd that my crawling dad barely raised a glance, though I suppose it was not the oddest thing about that year. One thing that was nice, or refreshing even, about my dad crawling was that it seemed to have stopped him developing new uncharacteristics. Once he'd gone down on all fours, he never found any new obsessions, never felt the need to change his appearance, never started exhibiting any new mannerisms or accents. It was as if all of that experimentation had just been a long process of discovery, trial and error leading him towards his final form, his final truth, that he was meant to crawl the earth rather than walk it. We're more aware now than we were than that people are often ill-suited for their lot in life, whether genetic or environmental, and that the only chance at contentment for many involves altering some of these things by force. For my dad, it seemed this was the thing he'd had to alter. He didn't ever seem particularly discontented while he was vertical, though I can't definitively say he was happy either. I suspect the hobbies and other attempts at transformation would frustrate him when they didn't work as he'd hoped they would, and you could sense a certain lowness about him when this happened. Each phase would have a honeymoon period lasting no more than a week or two before he'd either start to sway, gradually reintroducing prohibited foods, for instance, or outright change course quite suddenly, the shift from standard Protestantism to a kind of mystic scientism. Come to think of it, one victim of all this constant shifting and twisting around might have been his ability to have and care for a family. We were one of the few permanent results of a personality, a phase which involved him being a caring and devoted husband and father, and one which might have stood in the way of the drifts to come. When he fancied himself a writer or an inventor, I remember feeling more than ever that we were a hindrance rather than a blessing or a core component of his own identity. While he never expressed this outright, it was something we could all sense, and I think we only accepted it because we all knew that it wouldn't last very long before he adapted into something for which we were a welcome addition. In any event, whatever discontentment he may have experienced in the course of all these things dissipated entirely once he started crawling. He'd found his thing, and we were all glad for him. I don't think any of us thought much more of it than that until later, when the other dads started joining in. I'll admit that, like all 9-year-olds, I wasn't paying as much attention as I should have been. Any childhood is comprised of moments, really, a procession of abstract glimpses and impressions that can't be coalesced into a coherent story until long after that part of the story is over. I remember being confused when grown-ups would be able to talk about life holistically, interpreting things from the past and extrapolating into visions of the future. It might as well have been magic, and I suppose in many instances it is like magic, or at least appears to have the same rate of failure as any other nebulous, esoteric form of divination. And though I believe I am able to recount the events of that winter in a way which represents the truth of what they were and the implications they might have, I suppose I can't be sure either. All I can do is try to remember the least of what it was, something no one else seems fit or willing to do when it's brought up. Our town was a family town, in the sense that people between the ages of about 18 and 35 didn't really exist there. You were either a kid or a parent or a grandparent. The kids would often leave as soon as they were able, and stay gone until they were old enough to come back with a family. Who could blame them? There were precisely 0 avenues or establishments in the town itself where you weren't under the constant glance of sensible adults. As such, we were forced to develop and explore our independence out in the insecurity of wilds that immediately surrounded the town. Scattered throughout the woodland were gravel pits, disused shacks, and abandoned vehicles. The woods were our town. We made it ours. Indeed, so complete a microcosm of society it became. Its own machinations, rules, and class systems were organically and spontaneously established. Certain landmarks held functions, and there were areas which were de facto off-limits to those in the wrong circles. You knew, for instance, never to hang around the burned-out camper van if you weren't one of the Delaney brothers' crew. For kids my age, anywhere north of the mile-long creek which ran through the densest part of the forest, and whose water was discovered to be the source of the unusual prevalence of ocular cancer in the town's children, was unfriendly territory. That was the arena in which the activity of older kids would transpire. Drugs, revenge, and nascent fumbling sex acts. I say this simply to emphasize that there were essentially 2 towns. The town proper, where all the grown-ups lived out their grown-up lives, and then the town outer, where all the kids went to grow up. Any man, any full-grown adult male in the town was a dad to at least one of the kids there, with minimal, insignificant exceptions. No need to expound upon the one childless man who briefly occupied the role of town librarian, or the childless male couple who lived together in the nice part of town. Neither were there long enough for it to matter, and your guess as to why they left is probably the correct one. Some dads occupied the sort of roles you would expect of men in that sort of time and that sort of town. mechanics, locksmiths, store managers, but most of them worked at the factory a couple of miles away. The factory, known only and always as the factory, was our town's industry. It was credited with seeing us through several recessions and economic upheavals relatively unscathed and, as mentioned, with contaminating the creek that caused the unusual prevalence of ocular cancer in the town's children. In town, the factory was treated as unmoving, and essential a thing as the air itself, even less prone to variance, in fact. It sat, just elevated enough that its lone grey turret could be seen from virtually any vantage point within the town or its surroundings, although myself, and presumably most of the non-dad townsfolk, had never actually seen the entire building up close. It was sufficient to know that it was simply there, and it was there that most of the dads would go to work. I don't know what the factory was for, nor do I really know what my dad did there. From any discussion, form, or pay stub, the most I can discern is that he was a worker there. I never bothered to ask for any more detail than that, and he never offered any unbidden, like some dads might do. To him, it seemed his job was just a minor inconvenience, a tedious and unimportant necessity to facilitate his true passions, whatever they may have been that week. But he never complained about it, and he never missed a day, even after he'd gone horizontal. As I said, my dad was the same dad he always was. If anything, he became even more the same once he'd started crawling. There was nothing else to him, nothing new for us to acclimate to. He just crawled around, went to work, played with us kids, and crawled into bed with his wife at the end of it. Only one time do I remember it occurring to me that there might be something wrong with this. At that age, and for as long as I can remember before it, I always slept with my bedroom door open, looking out onto the landing. I don't know if there was any particular reason for it, but I couldn't have it any other way. And if one of my parents closed the door after putting me to bed, I would always rush up to open it again. There was nothing I was actually scared of, yet it would send a chord of terror down my spine as soon as that door closed while I was in bed. One night, I'd woken up suddenly from what must have been a bad dream. One of those ones so terrible that your memory rejects them outright, and you're just left with the dread sensation that you would experience the horror in sleep, and it might have followed you back out. The wind outside had been pummeling the trees, so the tendrils of their branches scratched against my window, adding sensory stimulation to my already overwhelmed juvenile limbic system. Instinctively, I did what I'd always done in the situation, and cried out for my dad. I'm unsure why he was always my first choice to comfort me when I was frightened. On balance, I'd say I was definitely closer to my mother, who, typically of the women in our town, had been much more present and involved in the key stages of my emotional upbringing, and certainly was my first port of call in any other emotional or physical state. But when it came to being frightened, it had to be Dad. Perhaps it was because I'd never seen him frightened by anything himself, and I knew he'd always come. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I heard the clumsy thump of limbs on their bedroom carpet, then the frantic patter of his hands slapping against the hardwood as he approached my door. It was then that I got the deep, distinct impression that something was wrong. Deeper than the sensation whatever nightmare I'd had already stirred within me. The sound of my dad approaching, the sound that would typically comfort me in a state like this, was making me more terrified than I'd ever been. I don't have words fit to begin explaining how much I utterly dreaded seeing him crawl past the doorway and into my vision. I closed my eyes tight right as the slapping sounds of his palms whacking themselves against the floor came closer, and then stopped. Silence now. He must have been outside my room, looking at me. I couldn't bear to open my eyes. I knew it was just Dad. I knew it would be the same Dad I saw every day. I was even used to Dad crawling. It never disturbed me in the slightest. But at that moment, I couldn't imagine anything more horrifying than what I knew I would see in the doorway if I were to open my eyes. He remained silent. I remained silent as well, stifling the sharp, panicked breaths that were trying to burst out of my chest. I wanted nothing more than to hear those same thumps and thwacks of limb upon wood retreating back to his bedroom. I couldn't explain nor rationalize it to myself. I simply wanted him gone. But still, there was silence. For how long, I could not say. Too long. My eyes instinctively wanted to open a little to see what was going on, but I forced them to remain firmly shut. I was locked in, suffused with the most primal physical fear I'd ever known up to that point, and remained that way until my eyes suddenly sprang open to reveal an empty room and an empty hallway, bathed in the morning light. The impact soon faded as with any nightmare, and I was untroubled when Dad came crawling into the kitchen for breakfast. But to this day, I won't sleep with my bedroom door even slightly ajar. By late October, it had become commonplace for the other dads to crawl. As with my own, I remember this being neither sudden nor gradual. I'd first seen one dad crawling down the main street, a thermos clutched in his free hand, and simply not thought much of it. A couple of days after that, it occurred to me that everyone's dad had been crawling, as if it had always been that way. It was a development, but not one that struck anybody as strange, wrong, or frightening. Nor did I credit my own dad with having started the trend. Soon after that, my dad became even more horizontal than he had been. He refused to assume any vertical orientation, and would no longer climb upwards onto chairs or into bed. He requested that we serve his plates on the floor at mealtimes. My mom never disclosed much at the time, and she says even less about it now. But I would sometimes be woken by sounds from their bedroom at night. Strange sounds. Not unnatural, but rather too natural. Sounds that I, as a child, could only imagine emanating from deep wilds or abattoirs. Eventually, Dad wouldn't even climb the stairs at night. I come down in the early morning to find him in the middle of the living room rug, prone like a sphinx, his eyes wide open, somehow even more open than when he was awake. Then he stopped sleeping entirely. By mid-November, the fog that had been descending daily from the woods became denser and permanent, and it became impossible to see more than 6 feet in front of you. Walking into town was akin to what I'd imagine walking through clouds to be like, with only blurry street lights and vague shapes and impressions to guide your way. More often than not, the shapes you'd see would be those of crawling beasts, skittering in and out of visibility, their details completely obscured by the deep murk that enshrouded us. Soon enough, the fog had become so heavy and pervasive that it seemed unwise to go out in, and we all began to stay home. All of us except the dads, that is. The dads would still leave their homes every morning as usual, on hand and foot. With nobody driving cars around town, it became their sole dominion to crawl. Nobody knew what they were doing, and nobody asked. We assumed they weren't going to the factory, which was more than 2 miles away through the woodland, an unthinkable journey to crawl. But it didn't affect us. And I imagine, if I'd had the forthrightness to ask questions, I would have squarely been told it was none of my business. In fairness, it wasn't any of my business. I would come to know that, whatever business this was, it existed far beyond my remit. That the dads were doing what the dads were doing is about as close to certain as I can be on the matter, and as long as Dad came home, I had no reason to concern myself with it any further. One evening, early December, Dad didn't come home. None of them did. They had left their houses that morning as usual, with no outward signifiers that this day would differ from any other, and they never returned. The following day, I remember accompanying my mom on a drive into the town's foggy maw to search for him, only to find all the other moms and kids doing the same thing. Headlights scanning vainly for things long since gone. Even at that young age, I somehow knew, intuited at least, that my dad was never coming back. It took some of that growing and comprehending I mentioned before to realize that Dad had already been gone a while before that day the dads disappeared. The next day, the moms organized a search party, scouring the woods around the town for dads. I wasn't allowed to go, so my older sister was left with me at the house. I remember spending the entire day staring out of my bedroom window. The only thing I could see through the impermeable mist was the factory's turret. Silent, unmoving in the distance. The only constant left. When Mom came back that evening, I heard sobs, harsh breaths, and the frantic exchange of hushed voices between her and my sister. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I sat hidden at the top of the stairs and tried my best to make out what had been discovered. My mom has never spoken about it again. Any of it. Not my dad, not the crawling, not the fog, not the town, not the factory, not what they had found there. After corroborating with my sister, what I know is this. The moms had followed several trails, hand and footprints, coming from all different angles into the forest. Along these trails, they found articles of clothing, Dad's clothing, across the forest floor. Although the clothes hadn't simply been removed, they had been bifurcated precisely down the middle, as if carefully sliced off whatever was wearing them, and they were hot to the touch, in spite of laying on the cold earth for at least a whole day. Gradually, the various trails of prints had begun to coalesce and meet in the middle. Beyond the point they all met, about 1 mile south of the factory, they formed one single trail. One set of hand and footprints, the size of 70 men's put together, which crawled in a straight line directly to the factory. The very next morning, we left town. I'd been woken up by Mom around dawn, who listlessly told me we were going and we wouldn't be coming back. I barely had time to fill a backpack with my things, let alone begin to comprehend the emotional weight of all that was happening and what it meant. Dad's possessions were left entirely untouched. I got the distinct impression that nobody would ever touch them again. As my mom listlessly drove the car through the last of the mist, which dissipated as soon as we had pushed through the town surrounding woodland and broke free of its limits, she kept her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. If at any point she had looked behind her, she would have seen the town swallowed whole by the fog. All except for the factory, which still stood tall in the far distance, glowing deep red from within as if filled with an infinity of burning coals. My father's new neighbor. It was November 2 years ago when my father reached out to me about a noise problem with his new neighbors. A year earlier, I had managed to save enough money to buy him a half-hectare property and build a 2-story house in a fishing village. My hope was to give him a peaceful retirement away from the city. I thought he would have no trouble settling in, because many of our relatives lived nearby on his mother's side, and when I inspected the place 3 years before, it was quiet and serene. Things began to change with the passing of his longtime neighbor, a retired soldier. 2 months ago, my father told me the man had died suddenly of a heart attack. His children tore down the old wooden house and sold off his collection of antiques. That broke my father's heart. A new 2-story house was erected, and the former colorful and wholeheartedly cared-for orchidarium of the late veteran was flattened into a plain stretched front yard. About a month later, someone moved in. My father shared that he thought they must be elite-level rich. 2 large trucks arrived, and a team of men unloaded many boxes. These were not ordinary movers. Their polished trucks, their blue and black jumpsuits, and their foreign appearance gave off a different kind of vibe. Then, a black car arrived, of which he thought was someone or someone's, but it was strange because they didn't go out, which is the normal thing to do. Instead, the garage door opened remotely, and the car went straight inside. The movers, or whatever they were, just hopped in their trucks and went off. Safe to say that their first impression unsettled him. According to him, they stayed quiet for a week and never went outside to introduce themselves, which is customary in our culture. At night, only the first floor of their house seemed lit. A single lamp in the living room, or so my father thought. After that, the problems began. He said it started when a loud, high-pitched buzzing woke him, and a sharp zip that followed now and then felt like it could burst his eardrums. He checked the clock. It was midnight. He peeked through the window but saw nothing, since their house was the only one pitch black on the street block. This went on for many nights. After 2 weeks, he decided to move and live with my younger sister in the next city. I work as a seaman, and my contract ended in the 2nd week of December. As soon as I arrived, I went to see my father. I was furious when I saw how stressed he looked. He was fighting cancer, and the sleepless nights were making everything worse. I even considered admitting him to the hospital, but he convinced me not to. The next day, I went to his house. I planned to arrive around noon, which I believe is the best time to discuss and settle neighborhood problems. My father was right about the house across the street. It was 2 stories high with tinted windows and a closed front door. The grass in the yard was uncut, and the mailbox was stuffed with letters, with more piling on the stand. If I had not known anything about the owner, I would have thought the place was abandoned. I smoked a cigarette before stepping onto the concrete patio and toward the varnished wooden door. I pressed the doorbell, inhaled, and unwrapped the paper packaging of an assorted chocolate box I had brought from Europe. The first ring went unanswered. On the second, a man's voice came through the speaker. "Hello, how may I help you?" His accent was posh, each word crisp. I felt the pressure of speaking back, almost hesitant to respond. I explained that I was the son of the neighbor next door, and asked if it was a good time to introduce myself, as was supposedly the custom in our neighborhood. The truth was different. The tradition was a lie. The chocolate box only baked, and I simply wanted to meet them face to face. "Thank you for the kind present. However, we are occupied at the moment. If you will be kind, please place it by the doormat. Thank you." That was the end of our exchange. I tried to continue, but the other side remained stubbornly silent. I stood there, facing the camera for a few minutes before setting the chocolate box down on the dusty doormat and offering a quiet farewell. I went to one of my father's cousins, who wasn't a serviceman, but had a basement full of weapons and a collection of tactical gear for both business, although unregistered, and for hobby. I bought one firearm and a night vision binocular and returned to the house. I sat on the couch, locked into a marathon of shows, forcing down bottles of energy drinks just to keep my eyes open. The clock became my constant companion, each minute dragging as I glanced outside toward the neighboring house. My father had been right. Only one light glowed, the one near the front window, likely from the living room when the night came. The stillness made it feel even more deliberate. I just right away felt that it was weird. I armed myself, picked up my father's flashlight, steadied myself, and stepped out into the backyard. Every time I came home to visit my father, I would smoke, drink, and relax in his backyard, surrounded by the quiet of his vegetable garden under the starry skies. That night felt different. A heavy unease hung in the air, as if the darkness itself were pressing against me. I switched on the flashlight and followed the leaves-covered patio path until I reached the back wall, all the while keeping a wary eye on the house. I paced the straight path 3 times, searching for anything out of place, but nothing seemed wrong. Back inside, I brushed my teeth, then settled again on the couch to continue watching the show. Around 1:45 p.m., my sister called to check on me. We spoke briefly before I wandered into the kitchen to brush my teeth once more. I was just about to rinse my mouth when I heard the faint slide of the glass window, likely from the bedroom. I rushed outside and raised the intense white beam of the flashlight, a decision I regret to this day. From the wide rectangular window, something began to hover slowly into view. It was half a body of a man, or what once resembled a man, suspended by metallic tethers that glinted in the light. A chill ran down my spine when I saw his appearance. His straight black hair was combed neatly back, his thin lashes almost perfectly aligned, and his hollow eyes locked onto mine with piercing emptiness. His cheekbones jutted sharply from sunken skin, and worst of all, his mouth curved upward as if he were smiling. His thin body frame was twisted, scattered with metallic tubes and broken patches where sheets of metal pushed through torn flesh. His upper torso looked as though it had been ripped from its other half brutally, the skin ragged and uneven at the tear. From the lower edge of his body, something hung, and though I could not be certain at the distance, it seemed like a necrotized colon protruding downward. He turned his face toward me with dreadful slowness, and my knees gave out. I just collapsed and screamed maniacally. The left side of his face was stripped bare, all skin and flesh gone, leaving only the bone. From the hollow socket of his left orbital burned a blood-red glow. The other half of his face was tangled with metallic wires, scattered in chaotic strands that clung to him like parasites, pulsating in unnerving rhythm. He, or whatever it was, forced open the stiff mouth, and red, blue, and yellow lights flared from within in pulsating alternations. From the rectangular window emerged a swarm of drones, their buzzing and zipping noises stabbing into my skull until it felt as though my brain would explode. I remember involuntarily striking my head against the soft ground 3 times before my vision went black. When I opened my eyes, the neighbors were circling me. Most were senior citizens, and their faces drawn with worry. Morning had already broken, and I was lying in the front yard of my father's house. An older woman, who introduced herself as a former nurse, was pressing a cloth to my forehead, and told me I had a bad tear in my forehead skin. She said she had called an ambulance from the nearest town and that I should stay still. I asked if anyone had seen or heard what happened during the night. They only shook their heads or denied. I glanced up at the house. The front rectangular sliding window was closed and untouched. No damage, no trace. A gentleman leaned in with a grin and asked what I had taken last night. He wanted me to share it so he could try the trip I had been on. He did not bother to hide his favorite pastime from his younger years. I almost believed it had all been a hallucination or a bad dream. Then a sharp pain knifed through my stomach and I vomited. Among the sour mess lay a drone the size of half my palm. It writhed and twisted before staying still. Seeing that, I lost my consciousness. I never went back. We sold the property and built a house for my father near my sister. I never told him what happened. He died last month without knowing the truth. Even now, I keep turning the question over in my head. Why was there a tiny drone inside me? What was that being? I try to answer and fail, but all I know now is that I have a dreadful phobia of drones. Drones! 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 I despised them. I went hiking to look for my missing dad. I should have never gone up that mountain. My father and I loved hiking. Not the casual kind, the kind where the air thins, where the wind feels like knives and every step burns. He used to say the cold washed the noise off his mind. I never understood that until I was older. That day was supposed to be one of those days. We had a cabin we always used as a starting point. Same place every time. Same routine. Coffee, map check, climb. But when I got there, he wasn't. At first I didn't panic. The road up the mountain gets icy, and the forest can swallow sound. I figured he got held up. But an hour passed. Then 2. I called him. No answer. I called again. Nothing. My father was a serious man. Scheduled, strict, always early. His missing a planned hike wasn't just unlike him. It was impossible. I stayed in that cabin for 6 days. I must have called his phone 7 times a day. Eventually, I realized I wasn't calling to reach him. I was calling just to hear the ringing. If the line was still live, then maybe he was too. I should have called 911 immediately. But fear makes you stupid. Fear makes you small. So I did the only thing that felt real. I followed the plan. I went to the mountain. I started climbing. Something was wrong the moment I stepped onto the trail. The air wasn't just cold. It was dead. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just the crunch of frost under my boots. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Halfway up, the sun slipped behind the ridge. The trees stretched long, thin shadows across the path. Everything dimmed. I checked my watch. Too late to keep going. I found a flat ledge near the stone outcrop and set up camp. That's when I found the first bone. Not small, not an animal. Something long, thick, snapped clean down the center. The marrow was hollowed out. The white is stained, brown and flaking. Something had eaten it. Recently. The bone was still wet. My chest tightened. It looked human. But it couldn't be. My father was strong, unbreakable. What did you get yourself into, Dad? Sleep never came. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw his breath in the cold, heard him laughing on the trail, and beneath that memory, something hungry, something waiting. Then I heard it. Movement in the brush, slow at first, then heavier, closer. Then his voice. Son, I've been waiting up here. Took your sweet time. For a moment, I almost unzipped the tent. But the voice was off. Too loose. Too soft. My father always spoke like he was cutting through stone. This voice sagged. Melted. I unzipped the tent just an inch. A figure stood in the dark. Wrong size. Wrong shape. A foot too tall. Limbs too long. And above its shoulders, a deer skull. Before I could react, something slashed. The tent tore open. Claws ripped across my arm. I felt blood soak into my sleeve, hot against the cold air. I screamed and threw myself out into the frozen ground. I ran, blind panicked, feet pounding the trail, breath burning my throat. I didn't realize I was running up the mountain, not down, until the trees thinned and cold stars opened overhead. The summit. I was bleeding, dizzy, no cover, no way to hide. Then I heard it again. Son. It stepped into view. A towering skeletal body, skin stretched thin over bone, a massive deer skull for a head, antlers branching like black lightning. But its mouth, too human, moved beneath the bone. You shouldn't have run. I'm hungrier now. It charged. I curled up, arms over my head, bracing for the strike. But when it hit me, it didn't break me. I was heavier than I expected. I felt it lose footing, saw the antlers tilt, claws scraping rock, then it fell. I heard it tumbling, branches snapping, stone cracking, then silence. I never checked if it survived. I just kept walking until I saw headlights, a ranger's truck, a real voice. I never saw my father again. I still hike. It's the only place I feel close to him. But I won't go back to that mountain. Not yet. Maybe one day when I'm ready, I'll go back and talk to him. And those were Dad Crawled by GrimmerComforts, My Father's New Neighbor by Dependent Bit 5128, and I Went Hiking to Look for My Missing Dad. I Should Have Never Gone Up That Mountain by kctheshadow. 3 tales of woe involving fathers. Would you have survived all these encounters? Might you have done things differently yourself? Let me know down in the comments below. Which story did you like best? I personally liked them all. I've been your host, Nate at Night. Be sure to sleep tight.